And now, please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, on the morning of December 4th, just a few weeks ago, in Midtown Manhattan, the CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, was going into a work meeting, a shareholders meeting, when someone approached him on the street, pulled out a gun, and shot him dead. And in the next week plus, we witnessed the manhunt for this assailant. And finally, Luigi Mangione was arrested in Pennsylvania and has been extradited to New York City. Now, in the last 2 weeks, I can't recall another time where I've seen such an incredible outpouring of emotion and energy around a tragedy like this one. Within hours of Brian Thompson's death, his murder, you had people on Twitter, aka X, I think I'll always still call it Twitter, celebrating this and lifting up Mangione as a hero, as someone who is doing good for the people. And especially this became even more prominent once Mangione's identity came out and people noticed how attractive he was. All of a sudden, he became that much more of a hero for those who are standing up to the powers that be. And you had a very strong reaction against that, too. You had the sort of simmerings of class warfare coming up. Oh no, would this lead to more assassinations of business leaders in our country? What would happen? And you saw the extreme reactions displayed when Mangione was extradited to New York, and it seemed like a veritable army of New York City Police Department officials, plus the mayor of New York, escorting him to his new prison cell. And amidst all of the back and forth and all of the conversations about this tragedy, one thing struck me more than anything else, and that was reading through the biography of Luigi Mangione. Here is someone who was raised in a nice suburb outside of Baltimore. He is a son of privilege. He's someone who was the valedictorian of his high school. He's someone who then went to an Ivy League school, University of Pennsylvania, got a master's degree in 4 years, was working in tech. I can't help but think when I see the story of Luigi Mangione that he could very easily have come from Wellesley. He could very easily be any one of our children or those that they know at high school. And so the inevitable question is why? Why did this come about? What happened? How did someone who grew up with such privilege, with such education, was so well-grounded, was such a success in his early life, how could someone like that be transformed into a murderer? Now, of course, it should be said that our healthcare system is broken. I have not talked to a single person who works in healthcare who would say that our system is a well-functioning system. We have a fee-for-service model that we've inherited over the last 100+ years that leads to a variety of things, among them services being done, medical services being done that are perhaps unnecessary, additional charges being racked up on a per-service basis. You have back and forth to try and get as much money as possible. The capitalism in our healthcare system is good because it's led to amazing advances in healthcare, really, truly incredible, life-changing advances. But the disadvantage of having capitalism in healthcare is that demand is inelastic, to use an economic term. In other words, if your child is sick, you're going to pay any price to make sure that he or she gets the treatment they need. Demand is inelastic. It's not flexible. So it's not a perfect market. Plus, you have the government involved in it. United Healthcare, it's coming out in the recent weeks, United Healthcare is a company that had $23 billion in net profit last year. Good for the shareholders of United Healthcare, but is that great for our broader healthcare system and the costs that continue to spiral out of control? And this one healthcare insurer has the highest rates of denial of claims of any other major health insurer in the country. We have a real problem here. And then you look at Luigi Mangione himself. Here's someone who, by all accounts, had a major health emergency. Chronic back pain. If anyone's experienced chronic back pain, you can know how debilitating it can be. I was a rower in college. I knew a lot of people with major back issues. And I'm sure many of you suffer from them as well. He had a failed surgery. You can see the frustration. One account talks about people in his family also having frustrations with the healthcare system. I can see the frustration. But it doesn't explain then why you go and kill someone. There's a difference between seeing a broken system and then murdering an innocent person. What's going on? Why did this happen? In our text for today, we have the great Magnificat that Kelly read just a moment before. The name Magnificat comes from those first lines of Mary's, "My soul magnifies the Lord." Have you read the text closely? Did you notice anything when Kelly was reading it out? Luigi Mangione could very well have quoted from the Magnificat in the manifesto that was found upon him. Look at these words. Listen to these words. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. These are words that could be used by a revolutionary. But of course they're not. Why? Because there's a certain context here. There's a narrative that shapes them. These words are coming from Mary that are grounded in God. That's why they're not used as a revolutionary manifesto. The narrative matters. In the last 50 years, one of the most important theological developments was that of narrative theology. And there are lots of nuances to it, and I don't want to bore you for the next hour and a half giving a lecture on the fine points of narrative theology. But one of the common themes of this particular school is that narratives, the narratives we tell ourselves, the stories that shape our lives, shape our identities, and they shape our ethics. How we act in the world is largely determined by the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and our place in the world. So for instance, you might be someone, and this is true, this is less true in certain families now, but was true for a long time, where when you were a kid, you were told stories about who you were based on who your people are. Maybe you were someone who's descended from the Pilgrims or other people who came over in the Great Migration, and this is part of your identity. And it's explained to you by your parents what that means. It's supposed to shape your conduct. Or maybe you were someone whose ancestors came over in one of the great immigration waves in the 19th century or early 20th century. There's some great initial person who came over. Their courage, that person's strength of character, determines who you are. You get told these stories about your family, and those stories shape your own internal narrative. They shape how you act. There was a time also when schools shaped certain narratives. I know when I was in high school, we had to act a certain way because we were Roxbury Latin boys. And that had with it a certain narrative, a certain story that shaped our ethics. In our country has a certain narrative that shapes the way in which we treat others and go about our conduct in the world. How that story is told is one that's hotly debated right now because it matters. Stories matter. The stories you tell yourself matter. I mean, I think about when I was a senior in high school, I was on the wrestling team. And I was one of the co-captains of the wrestling team. And I remember coming to the final match of the year, the Graves-Kelsey. And I would sort of try and wrestle up here, but I don't want to. I've never actually wrestled in a robe before. And I was there, and so the first match of the day, I go out on the mat, and it was this replacement person, not the person I was supposed to wrestle, from Middlesex. And I go out there, and I'm like, oh, I got this. Before I know it, he took me down and turned me over on my back, and I was behind. And he continued to be behind and just not wrestling very well. We get to the third period, which in wrestling is the final period, and there's 30 seconds left. And I remember being pushed out of bounds and going back and thinking to myself, what's going on here? And I remember, I'll never forget this. I sat there and I said, this is not who I am. I am not someone who is going to go out in the first round of the Graves-Kelsey tournament my senior year. This simply will not happen. Went down, whistle blew. I reversed the guy, put him on his back, won the match by a point, and I got off the mat, and my coach was like, well, that was closer than it should have been. And I was like, yep. These narratives matter. They can also matter in really negative ways. Or positive ways. Think about the ways in which we tell stories about what it means to be a man in society today. There was a time when you were told this, what it means to be a man, your self-identity as a man, is to be a gentleman, to open the door for a woman, to show respect, to be someone who's morally upstanding. It's like, oh, be a good man, be a gentleman. It has all sorts of connotations, stories with it that shape actions. Well, unfortunately, some of these stories are changing, courtesy of people like Andrew Tate. And last month, I remember talking to one of my colleagues who serves a church in Massachusetts. She's a daughter in high school. And she said her daughter went to high school the day after the election, and there were a group of boys there that were then chanting at the teenage girls, "Your body, my choice." What narrative did they have in their head about what it means to be a man, that that's what you're supposed to say as a high schooler? These narratives make a difference. And the reason why Luigi Mangione did what he did is because of the narrative that was going through his head. He was isolated. He had no one around him to tell him that this was the wrong type of narrative to have. He's very bright, which can be very dangerous. He read extensively, including the Manifesto of the Unabomber. And even though I don't know the story that he was telling himself, I can imagine it quite well. And he kept telling himself that story again and again as he plotted out this horrible crime, as he found a way to get a firearm. And I bet he was still telling himself that narrative at the moment that he pulled the trigger. Narratives make a difference. And so the question is for us, like, what sort of narratives do we tell ourselves that shape our conduct and who we are? We all have a bunch of different narratives that help identify us. The question is, which are those that are important to you? You could have a narrative of being a provider, a narrative of being a good parent and what that means, a narrative of being a good citizen, a narrative of being a good Christian. These narratives can go in positive ways and negative ways, but how we tell those narratives makes a difference. And we have a particular narrative that comes from Mary in our text for this morning. Here is Mary, a poor woman by any standard, in a rural area of Palestine, likely a teenager. Some accounts have her where her parents are probably not around or in the picture. And she gets chosen to be the one to carry the baby Jesus. For Mary, we see in her narrative this intense knowledge and appreciation of the presence of God all around. That's part of her narrative. When things happen in life, she sees the hand of God at work. That's part of the narrative that she tells herself. Another key element of this narrative is that God lifts up the lowly and asks all of us, even those who are successful, to be humble. When those narratives run through our minds and we see someone who's suffering, the narrative if that narrative is our primary narrative, we reach out and help that person rather than blame them. We see someone who's in need, and rather than saying, oh, well, that person deserves it, having one particular narrative, we say, my job as a Christian is to help that person. A narrative that talks about the presence of God is you go around the world and you can see the presence of God. And when you actually have those God lenses on, it changes the way you approach the world. Bad things can happen, but you can still have hope because you're like, a God of love is here, and I believe that. And so even though things might not be great, I believe that something better is there and that goodness is fundamentally there. That narrative, telling yourself that narrative, makes a difference with how you interact with the world. If you yourself are in pain or going through suffering and you hear these words from Mary, that God lifts up the lowly, you're like, God sees me and sees my pain and in some way can help me. These narratives make a difference. But here's also an important thing. Whatever narratives predominate are those that we let predominate, and our community makes a difference. You are the company that you keep. I can't help but see the story of Luigi Mangione and think, what if this young man had a church community that he was involved with? If he had other people to talk to and say, this is my frustration and this is my pain, and they could hear that and give sympathy. And when he said, oh, the correct answer is to go and kill someone, they could say that's not the way forward. There are other ways forward. Let's put that energy towards something constructive. The community makes a difference. The community that can shape those values. You've all had situations where you run with the bad crowd and all of a sudden a good kid turns bad because the community helps shape that narrative. We see that tremendously in this past year around politics, where when you hang out with just Democrats or hang out with just Republicans, it's easy to come up with these narratives about the other side, some of which are based in truth, but a lot of which are not. And one of the reasons why I'm intent on having a big tent here at the Hills Church is because we need those other narratives to correct ourselves, to lead us to be better. We need to be with other people that have different narratives when it comes to political things. That's important. And as Christians, the core narrative is this narrative that we see coming out of the words and joy from Mary. And that's why coming here to church, being involved in this space and being reinforced by the narratives here is so important. You are the company that you keep. And when you hear this narrative, it's a narrative that brings forth hope, that God is at work in the world. It's one that can give you inner peace when things are not doing well. It's one that can spark joy and also lead you to love. So on this Christmas week, take a moment and think about that day back in Palestine 2,000 years ago, where the angel Gabriel came to Mary and told her this impossibly good news. See that action unfold, and let that story be the one that shapes your life.